Hi, my name is Grant Rye.
And I'm Katherine Saaid.
And today we're going to teach you about how to incorporate biblical storytelling into your daily life.
So let's get started. First, we need to talk about what is Bible storytelling. In Western culture, we tend to value more scholarly or literate or analytical learning styles, and we tend to do that and try to apply that to learning a story, which stories come from a more Eastern culture, so we have to get into that mindset of valuing a more relational, a more oral, and conceptual to get the big picture of what's happening in a story.
So functionally, that comes down to the difference between memorization and internalization. Think of memorization more like a textbook. It has a bunch of facts that you need to go through and memorize exactly. This is something very much like when you were younger and in middle school and you had to memorize poetry to recite in front of the class. Or if you were in a play or theater production, how you had to take a part, memorize it word for word, and reproduce it exactly for an audience. That is not what this is. Instead, we're talking about internalization, which is much more similar to when you're sharing one of your childhood stories. Imagine this. You're sitting around a campfire with friends, sharing a story about how when you were little, learning how to ride a bike for the first time, and your dad let go, and your bike crashed into a bush that turned out to be filled with poison ivy, and you got rashes everywhere, okay? That's not a story that you have memorized, but you know the story like the back of your hand.
Yeah.
It's been internalized in you. It's a part of who you are, and you're able to just share the whole story, even though you're not saying the same words every single time. That's what we're trying to get at with biblical storytelling. Oh.
So we want to learn stories in this way because it helps us be more natural in our relationships whenever we bring the story up in conversation.
For example, I'm an RA at a Christian university, and one day, one of my students came up to me late at night and shared with my RA partner and I that he was struggling with feeling very sad and down and depressed recently because he just hadn't really seen God working in his life, and he felt like he wasn't connected to God in the way that he should be because of that. And I was able to naturally transition into the story of Elijah and how everything with the prophets of Baal had happened. And in the very next chapter, we see Elijah in the mountains and how he's waiting for God's presence, and he's all sad and depressed because he thinks that he's the only one left. And the fire comes by, the earthquake and the winds, and none of that has God, but instead God is in the still small voice. And that shows the fact that, divine silence doesn't mean divine inactivity. We just need to continue to pursue God faithfully, even when we don't feel him there, because God's always still there. I was just able to encourage him, one, in that truth, and two, in the fact that these great people in the Bible that we look up to, they struggle with those same thoughts and feelings and emotions that we do. And that doesn't negate their faith, just in the same way that it doesn't negate our faith. We just need to keep moving forward.
Yeah. So whether it's in a Christian setting like that or a more secular setting, you're able to bring up, in very natural conversation, bring up a story to give an idea of who God is, or maybe help somebody in a situation like that. So for me, I used to work at a bank, and so that would be the more secular setting. And I had a coworker who had questions about who God is and about lifestyle and different things like that. And as I built a relationship with her, I began to tell her stories from the Bible. And it wasn't just one story. I wanted to give her a picture of who God is and how he interacts with us as people. And so I ended up drawing little cards of giving her kind of the meta-narrative, the big picture, little stories from Genesis all the way till Revelation that express God's redemptive nature towards us. And as that happened, she actually came to faith, and even our other coworkers would come and look at those cards every week as we put them up, and I think they even got a clearer idea about who God is.
So, moral of the story, by sharing these stories, we're able to more naturally flow into conversation with the people around us in order to teach these truths to them and share that with them what the Bible is saying, but in a non-threatening and natural way that doesn't feel preachy or like we're laying out a sermon for them.
So, how do we go about internalizing these stories instead of memorizing them? Well, the first thing we need to do is overcome that barrier of fear that most of us face when it comes to learning these stories. We're afraid that we're going to mess it up, that we're not going to get the story right, and therefore we're going to somehow misinterpret and mistell the scripture to somebody else. And the best way to overcome that fear is by doing exactly the opposite of what you would think, and that's to read the story once or twice, put it away, and say it out loud, no matter what mistakes you make. And you do this in a controlled environment where you're only saying it to yourself or to someone that you're learning it with. That way it's okay when you make these mistakes. But when you go through and you say the story out loud, you're going to notice the mistakes that you make. You go back afterwards, read the story, note what you forgot, and then you tell the story again. And that will help you to cement the story in your mind and all of the details of it. But because you're telling the story before you become intimately acquainted with the specific words that are used in the story, you're learning the story in a way that comes naturally to you and the way that you speak, and not just repeating the words word for word.
Yeah. And so one method that I had learned at a training that goes along with what Grant said is a method where you print the same story in different Bible translations. So like a New King James, an NIV, ESV, NLT. So you want about 3 to 5 translations, and you get a group of people sit in a circle. Each person gets one, and then we read it about twice, put it away. Then you pick a partner and you tell them the story in your translation, and they tell it to you in theirs. Again, you're not trying to memorize. You're not going to be like, oh, I'm going to tell it word for word exactly how the ESV says it. That's not, we're trying to get the story as a whole, not word for word. So then after you tell it, what we do is we rotate then the translation. So I get a new translation, he would get a new translation. We're going to read it again twice, put it away, not look at it, and then again tell it to your partner, and they're going to tell you theirs. By doing this a few times and getting through all the translation, it helps us get into the mindset of, okay, this is all the Word of God. It's in different translations the wording might vary slightly, but not in meaning, not in content. And so that will help us not want to say the exact same words. By the end, you're going to have learned and internalized the story and have told it in your own words.
And one thing we often forget is that by doing things and like this and saying the story out loud, we're tying the story to these different memory cues that we have. We have these different kinds of memories that we often don't really utilize. And there's auditory memory, there's visual memory, there's kinetic memory, there's memory based off of location. And we can apply these all to how we're internalizing these stories. So for example, when you tell the story out loud, you have this auditory cue that you have to remember the story now by the way that you've heard yourself tell the story. And when you write down the story, if you take the time to do that, you're gonna have a very kinetic cue that you can help remember the story with. If you draw little pictures, that's gonna have a very visual cue that you can use. There are location-based things. I know that sometimes if I'm reading a book and I'm trying to remember a quote from the book, sometimes I won't remember the exact page number that happened on, but I'll remember, it was on the left page, 3/4 of the way down. And so that helps me find the quote. And sometimes even just remembering that placement helps me to remember the words for the quote better. And so you can mix that in with writing down the story, because now you're going to remember the words and the placement on the page of where you wrote it. And therefore that will help you remember the story better.
Yeah, so the more cues you use, the better you're going to remember the story, because we've used different methods to solidify the story from different angles, different cues that your brain will know to remember. In the same way, we have different learning styles. So although you want to maybe utilize many different ones so you can really get the story down, it helps for you to know what maybe learning style works best for you. Is it if I see it, then I'm going to recall it better and faster and more accurately? Or is it if I hear it? Or is it if I walk around as I tell the story? What method best works for you, but also remembering to also know your audience, the person or the people that you're telling it to, and maybe what format or method that they would best be able to accept and learn the story as well.
Yeah. So honestly, what do you need to do now? Go find a story that you're not super familiar with from the Bible, and take the time to read it once, say it out loud, figure out what you forgot. Go through, try these different methods of writing down the story, drawing pictures for the story, trying to remember like the locations on the page for what you wrote when you wrote down the story, and find out what works best for you. And then go through, figure out who you could tell it to and how they would best receive it, and tell someone the story.
Yeah, remember, don't be afraid, and we just want to say thanks for watching.